Good afternoon and welcome to the Eugene Everteen's lecture on the Velizh Affair, Ritual Murder in a Russian Border Town. Dr. Everteen is an associate professor of modern Jewish history and the Tobor Family Scholar in the program of Jewish Culture and Society at the University of Illinois. He received his PhD in Russian and Jewish history at the University of Michigan. And he's the author of Jews in the Imperial State, Identification Politics in Tsarist Russia, published by Cornell University Press. I can give you a small description of the talk, but I think I'd rather let Dr. Everteen speak for himself. So thank you, Dr. Everteen. Thank you for coming. Also, if you're interested, we have our winter program coming up, and you can get brochures for that just outside. Thanks.
Thank you. Now erased from historical memory, the Velizh Affair was the longest ritual murder case in the modern world, and most likely in all of world history. I traveled to Velizh this past summer, and I'll tell you a little bit about where this town is located. This is on the way to Velizh. Velizh lies right inside, this is a picture of the Pale of Settlement as it was in the 19th century, right inside the Pale of Settlement, right close to Vitebsk. Today, if you're going to Velizh, the best way the way that I went is I traveled to St. Petersburg and then took a 17-hour train ride to Smolensk and then took an hour and a half car ride right over here to Velizh. So Velizh is a small town right inside the border of now Russia, and in the 19th century it was right inside the border of the Pale of Settlement. The investigation that I'll be talking about today lasted 12 years. In the early years of the 1917 revolution, the Commission for Investigating Blood Libel Materials, the records of which are located at the YIVO Institute, in which I've been able to work thanks in part to this fellowship, decided to publish the entire archive. That is, they wanted to publish all of the volumes. But those lofty plans were never realized. In late December 1920, as part of a nationwide campaign to centralize cultural organizations and initiatives, the Commissariat of Education and the Evsektsiya, the Jewish section of the Communist Party, basically dissolved the commission, and those lofty plans to publish the entire archive basically did not come to fruition. Thus, in spite of all the noble aspirations in the pre-1917 period and right around the revolution, the Velizh archive, all 25 bound volumes, sat untouched for over 90 years on the dusty shelves of the old Senate building, which is the Russian state, which was the old home of the Russian State Historical Archive. Now, I stumbled upon the case by sheer accident, and not at the Russian State Historical Archive, where I've worked for about 2 or 3 years for my first book project, but in Washington, D.C., in the most unlikely place. In the spring of 2008, I was on research leave at the Woodrow Wilson Institute for Scholars, and one afternoon while browsing the Library of Congress's online catalog, and one of the pleasures of working at the Institute is that we have, they basically have an agreement, so every book that it's at the Library of Congress you could basically have delivered to your desk. A book entitled The Memorandum of a Criminal Case, which happened to be that Senate, that 400-page volume that basically summarized the entire case, piqued my curiosity. To my surprise, when I called this book to my shelf, I received an oversized bound volume in sturdy brown leather without an official title page or place and date of publication. But after glancing at the first page, I quickly realized that this was the official protocol of a sensational ritual murder case prepared by the highest court in the Russian Empire. At that time, I thought that this 400-page document would be the subject of a book, and I would, have everything right there and then. So when I traveled a couple of years later to the Russian State Historical Archive in St. Petersburg, I immediately found the title in the card catalog, and for some reason I did not understand what these parts 1 through 25 meant. So I just thought that, okay, here's the case, I want to have the file. And then the archivist came up to me and said, "Do you realize how large this thing is?" And at that point, I realized that this was a massive case, an enormous case, that I would have, not just a 400-page document, but this would take quite a few years to get through. And so I've been working on this case for the last couple of years, and this was going to be the subject of my new book project. So let me tell you a little bit about the case and what happened there. This is a map of Velizh as it was in the 19th century, and I'll talk a little bit about the town, but what's important here is this place right here. This is the marketplace. This is where a lot of Jews lived. There were about 2,000 Jews out of 6,000 people here. And the largest, most important house that I'll be talking about in just a moment was right here. So this is kind of how the town. This is the geography of the town, and this is the Dvina River, which would play also an important role in the case. And Dvina. And here's the cast of characters that I'll be talking about today. This is just a small list of basically a very large and complicated set of characters. So what I've done is kind of basically simplified things for you. So on April 22nd, 1823, in a small white Russian border town by the name of Velizh, 2 small children finished their lunch and went to play outside. Fedor Emelian, this 3-year-old boy, with a white face, short blonde hair, gray eyes, a middling nose, and his 4-year-old cousin Avdyotya left their home and walked down a dusty path in an easterly direction. And let me just go back to this map. And basically what they did, they walked from this X to this O, and in that direction. And so when the children reached the Konevetsa Creek, which is this little creek right here, Avdyotya invited her cousin to cross a small bridge and continue on their walk to the forest. But Fedor refused and remained alone, gazing at the construction site of a new home on the embankment. A few days later, a neighbor found the body, Fedor's body, punctured in numerous places. In small market towns such as Velizh, where houses were basically clustered together, where residents knew each other on intimate terms, and where people gossiped in taverns, courtyards, and streets, even the most trivial bits of news spread like wildfire. And it did not take long before rumors had spread that the Jews had murdered the boy. This was basically a very, there was nothing extraordinary about this event. That is, this is how most, ritual murder cases kind of began. Given the intimacy of small-town relations in such a town, it is tempting to make the argument, as so many scholars do, that ritual murder accusations were the product of intense economic rivalries and deep-rooted anti-Semitic prejudice. Most of the work on ritual murder basically argues that it was a product of either the two or perhaps both. No doubt these reasons do help explain why certain individuals denounce Jews for engaging in blood sacrifices, I'll talk about in a moment. Yet, in my argument here is that these reasons do not offer a satisfactory explanation for the vitality of the tale in the popular psyche. And when I read these reports, one of the most amazing things that I encounter is that the entire Christian community, that is all other 4,000 people in this town, asserted that Jews were capable of committing ritual murder. They all believed it. So was this some sort of conspiracy? Did the townspeople, did everyone else in that town basically harbor resentment that was brought out in the open at the time of the investigation? Or were other more powerful forces at work? And so these were the types of questions that were in my head. So let's go back a little bit and give you a little bit of a history of what was going on here. As a consequence of the three partitions of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, Russia not only acquired the largest Jewish population in the world, but it also inherited an established cultural tradition of ritual murder. Most of the investigations that basically took place in the 18th and 17th century were precisely in those regions which were where this particular case took place, and where other cases in the 19th century were also basically took place. And that is in these northwest regions of this town, or of the Pale of Settlement, that is in Minsk, Vilna, Vitebsk, and Mogilev provinces. And where almost all the inhabitants of this multicultural land believed that Jews were capable of committing the crime, that they were capable of committing the crime of ritual murder. A central argument of my work, of my book in progress, is that the case that the Velizh case unfolded in a town like any other town in the Russian Empire, where people's lives were intimately connected, where rivalries and confrontations were part of day-to-day existence, and where the blood libel, where the belief in the blood libel was part of a well-established belief system. And it is precisely this part of this argument that I want to explore in more detail today. So let's return now to the dynamics of the case, and I want to just briefly tell you about what was going on here. So on Easter Sundays, Fedor's parents, Emelian and Agafia, waited for their son to return from his walk. But Fedor never came home that day, and for 2 days and nights, a small group of friends and family members basically searched unsuccessfully for the boy. On the third day, while Emelian and Agafia were home resting after their midday meal, a stranger knocked on the door. And from the testimony of several witnesses in the case, we know that the caller was a woman by the name of Mahdia Terentieva, who would play a very important role in the case. That is this drunk, crazy lady. As soon as Agafia opened the door, Terentieva declared that she would be able to locate the missing boy. She asked for a burning candle, and after placing the candle flame in a cold pot of water, revealed that Fedor was still alive, locked inside the cellar of Mirka Aronson's large brick house. That is that large brick house that was right in the center of town, and which you could, which is located right here on this picture. And here's kind of this one, and this is a picture of a contemporary view of the marketplace, which is no longer obviously the marketplace. There's a statue of Lenin right over there that you can't really see from this picture. This is when I visited the town this past summer. But this house would play an important role in the story that I'm going to be examining in more detail today, and it's still around today. Right now, it's actually a little museum that basically of the town itself. Ironically, during World War II, this house served as the headquarters of the Gestapo. So there is a little bit of an irony there. So the boy died basically a slow and painful death. And from the initial police report, now I'm not going to read the whole thing to you, but here they basically observed that the body was found in an overgrown shrubbery grass in a swampy forest, less than 1 kilometer from the center of town, and no more than 1 kilometer from the parents' home. The body lay around 64 meters from Shchetinskaya Road, a dirt road that could be taken to the center of town. And this proved very important to the investigation. Because if we read number 4 here, even if the officials were not able to determine the exact route, for the carriage tracks had been smeared by the traffic traveling back and forth on this dirt road over the course of several days, they concluded that whoever killed the boy had returned to town. So the investigation centered back on that town. So in other words, they wanted to find the perpetrators, and they immediately wanted to look to the town itself to make sure that somebody was there, and they wanted to find that person. And of course, that person was that the Jews were going to be investigated. So when Inspector Lukashevich, who would play an important role in the initial investigation, when he began this investigation, the autopsy report that was done revealed that the little boy was stabbed numerous times with blunt nails. The entire body was punctured with little round holes that were no more than 1 centimeter in depth. The skin on Fedor's feet, arms, stomach, and head had hardened and turned kind of a burnt yellow or red color, as though someone had vigorously scrubbed the boy's body with a coarse cloth or brush. The dark crimson bruise on the back of the neck signified that the cloth or rope was used to tie the boy's mouth. And whoever punctured the boy 14 times, the report concluded, did so to draw blood that was hidden within the very recesses of the skin. So that was important. So this was kind of and I didn't even share the entire report with you, but you could see that it's very detailed here. On May 5th, Inspector Lukashevich made a thorough search of Mirka Aronson's house. He immediately wanted to, recognize that the house itself played an important role, but was not able to uncover any evidence that linked Mirka or any other of the other members of the household with the murder. And there were a number of people who lived in this house. This was a very large, the biggest house in the town, and there were quite a few people of Mirka Aronson's extended family who lived in this town. One of which was Shmerka Berlin, registered officially as a merchant of the Third Guild. So he had a substantial kind of economic power in this town, that he was registered as a Third Guild merchant. He occupied a respected place in the social hierarchy of the town. Not only did he make quite a bit of money selling lumber and spirits and managing the only glass factory in the provincial district, but he also married into an affluent family that lived in this most magnificent 2-story brick house, the one that I've been talking about. Mirka Aronson's large 2-brick house was located in the very center of town, where most of the Jews in the town lived. On any weekday, this imposing structure was basically the site of much activity and commotion. A tavern and grocery store were located on the first floor, and customers from various parts of the town, as well as the surrounding villages, came to drink beer or vodka or to purchase foodstuffs from what was considered to be the town's best-stocked grocery store. The poor and needy showed up from time to time as well. On Saturdays and on holidays, the entire extended family, around 40 people in all, would gather for a meal on the second level of the house. Without the support, I should stress, without the support of their Christian neighbors, neither Shmerka Berlin nor Hanna Zetlina, who also occupied an important role in this story and who was also one of the wealthiest and most respected members of the town, would not have been able to basically do well economically. They would not have been able to operate successful taverns. They needed the support of their Christian neighbors. And all the respected residents of the town, from the wealthiest Polish landowners to the most powerful imperial bureaucrats, could be spotted from time to time at either Berlin's or Zetlina's tavern. We should, however, be careful not to paint life in this small little town as a multicultural idyll. This was a world that was consumed by conflicts, disputes, jealousy, and gossip. And as in so many other small towns and villages, communal unity in Velizh represented an ideal which was fairly remote from the reality. People bickered all the time, but most of the time these types of things not only worked out themselves, but if they didn't, then they went to kind of small provincial courts and they worked out their differences that way. If Mirka Aronson and Schmerker Berlin were regarded as two upstanding members of the community, Mahdia Terentieva, this drunk, crazy lady, was considered to be one of the town's most marginal characters. Mahdia had lived in the town for a year or two. It's impossible to know for sure because the testimony is contradictory, and survived on whatever food and money she could find. Several residents testified that Terentieva had led a debauched lifestyle ever since she came to town, giving birth to a son out of wedlock, stealing food every chance she could, walking in the streets at all hours of the night, screaming, "God help me, they're trying to suffocate me." Terentieva testified that on Easter Day, she made her way to the Konovetsa Creek, at which time she saw two little children standing on the bridge. One was a boy, and at that precise moment, Terentieva recalled, Hanna Zetlina, who owned that grocery store, walked up to the boy and took him away by the arm. Mahdia Terentieva's testimony proved devastating. Over the course of several weeks, authorities questioned dozens of Jews and Christians, and the court records, as I mentioned earlier, demonstrate how influential tales of blood sacrifice had become in the mindset of the town residents. Witness after witness asserted that basically they did not see perhaps Jews murdering the boy, but they know that they all knew that they were capable of doing it. And so this notion of capable of doing it would play an important role. Over the course of the investigation, the officials attempted to obey the letter of the law by not casting blame on any suspects until they had interviewed all possible witnesses, exhausted all possible lines of inquiry, and reviewed the forensic evidence. And as they questioned more and more people, gathered more and more evidence, communal tensions in the town began to rise. And how could they not? The Jews, it seems, thought it was just a matter of time before the most respected and wealthiest members of their community would be formally charged with murder. And also, the Jews, as the criminal case progressed, denied any kind of involvement in the murder itself. Hanna Zetlina, for example, submitted a formal appeal to the town council proclaiming her innocence, and she called all the accusations basically unfounded. She concluded her appeal by suggesting that in all likelihood, this drunk, crazy lady, Mahdia Terentieva, had invented the awful slander to settle an old score. The beggar woman, she claimed, had a habit of walking around town asking for charity. And on several occasions, after appearing on the doorstep, Zetlina had run her out of the house without giving her any handouts. That is, she did not give her any charity. And each time such an incident would occur, or had occurred, that is, every time that Hanna Zetlina would run Terentieva out of her house and not give her any kind of handout, this drunk, crazy lady would tell everyone in town how unjustly she was treated. At the age of 70, Mirka Aronson, the owner of that large brick house, tried to stay out of the day-to-day affairs of the family or pay any attention to gossipy talk. Nevertheless, while she had no idea who had killed the boy, there was no doubt in her mind that her son-in-law Schmerka or her grandson Hirsch were not involved in the murder because she knew for a fact that they stayed home all day. Showing signs of desperation, Schmerker Berlin, the merchant of the Third Guild, made the outlandish conjecture that someone had run over the boy accidentally and then proceeded to puncture the body to mask the death as a ritual murder. So this investigation, surprisingly or not, lasted for about one entire year, around 12 months. The result in the Russian imperial context was not an extraordinarily long judicial process. In the 19th century, criminal cases or even civil cases, for example, would drag on for many, many years. And it was not even a lengthy kind of judicial process, or the case itself did not even kind of generate a long, large kind of list of papers. Most in the Russian Empire, cases would drag on for years, and the cases themselves would be large because there was so much kind of bureaucracy involved. And the investigation did not even kind of have a startling resolution to the case. As we will see, before the judicial reforms of the 1860s and the 1870s, crimes that threatened the public interest or security of the state were usually tried according to the basic principles established by the inquisitorial procedure. And this is precisely how this case kind of took the shape that it took. The Velizh case basically followed the three basic stages of the inquisitorial process. First of all, it had the lengthy criminal investigation at the local level, the trial itself, which was a closed trial, and the review of the sentence by the highest court in the Vitebsk province. That is, it went to the provincial level. If convicted of blood sacrifice, the Russian government would not hesitate to impose the harshest penalties upon Jews for what it considered to be the most barbaric crime. But in the 19th century, or even in the 18th century, there was no conviction of ritual murder. That is, the Russian legal process never did convict Jews of blood sacrifice. Even though the Russian government did not discredit the blood libel directly, as did so many other European states. That is, the Russian government argued that, or the legal process argued that it could basically convict Jews of blood sacrifice if it found enough evidence. But it never did find enough evidence, as we will see. And it also kind of adhered to a policy of restraint. That is, that there was a legal mechanism that really kind of pushed for a lengthy and thorough criminal investigation. So exactly 14 months to the day that Fedor had disappeared, the Velizh appellate court handed down its verdict. First of all, although the court did not discount the possibility that this drunk crazy lady, Mahdia Terentieva, had invented their sensational tales to mask her own role in the murder, it did not completely dismiss her testimony either. So they were kind of wavering there. But based on a thorough review of all the material evidence and moral evidence, Hanna Tsetlina was formally acquitted. But the police nevertheless instructed to supervise her actions and behavior closely. Mirka Aronson and her household were cleared of any wrongdoing, as a thorough search of the home had failed to uncover anything remotely suspicious. Although the son-in-law, Schmerker Berlin, was reprimanded for spreading false rumors about the boy's death. In fact, the only person severely punished in the case was Mahdia Terentieva. To atone for her licentious ways of life, she was instructed, surprisingly, to appear before the Catolico Uniate Spiritual Consistory, to basically to transform her way of life from this kind of drunk, crazy state to a more kind of spiritual state. The acquittal of the Jews did not mean that the judges, criminal investigators, and provincial bureaucrats who were involved in the case, who presided over the case, were enlightened skeptics. but only the fact that a ritual murder case could not be proved at law. That is, that they did not find enough evidence to convict Jews of blood sacrifice. What they did find was the knives, supposedly, that they were used to kill the boy, and they had some other kind of evidence that they came up with as well. Here is kind of a picture of, and I'll give you of the early 20th century view of the town itself. Here is another kind of large road, or one of the main roads, where that Mirka Aronson's house stood as well. And here are some kind of contemporary views of the town that I took this past summer. As you could see, this town is in pretty bad shape. Most of the town was destroyed during World War II, and these particular structures were built after the war itself. And here you could see kind of the remnants from pre-World War II life in pretty bad shape here. And here's another picture of Ilinskaya Street as well. So on November 22nd, 1824, the most powerful court in Vitebsk province reviewed all the material evidence in the case and wrote off Fedor's tragic death as basically as God's will. Whatever the reason may have been, the documentary evidence suggests that a small-town quarrel ultimately led to the ritual murder accusation. Most likely, this beggar woman, Mahdia Terentieva, took advantage of the boy's death, or perhaps even killed him herself, which is my suggestion here, is to get back at Hanna Tsetlina for her refusal of charity. The culture of giving, the culture of charity, the teachings and beliefs about offering support to those in need played an important role in both Jewish and Christian and Russian communal traditions. The act of denying food, drink, money, or other charity typically caused the individual who had been turned away to feel angry and resentful. When a personal misfortune subsequently happened to the person who had acted selfishly, that is, turned away from charity, the latter would often suspect that the beggar had cast a magic spell against them for their callous behavior. Across most of Western and Central Europe, the overwhelming majority of documented witchcraft cases conform to the simple pattern that took place in Velizh, involving one neighbor's refusal to give a handout to another neighbor. Although in this case, as we saw, the internal logic was reversed, and the end result was a charge of ritual murder against a neighbor who refused to offer charity. In contrast to the typical witch case scenario, then, Terentieva represents the victim, right, who took matters into her own hands to get back at her well-to-do neighbor Tsetlina for failing to fulfill a social obligation. And that is kind of what I argue is kind of the reason that led to this ritual murder case itself. But if an ordinary neighborhood dispute around charity explains why one neighbor accused another neighbor of murdering a little boy, we are still left with a puzzle. Why did almost every other Christian resident interviewed in the case itself respond by saying that Jews were capable of committing the crime of ritual murder? Why was that belief so prevalent in that society? The answer, I argue, has less to do with what is often referred to anti-Semitism in the scholarly literature, or with even economic rivalries, although we should be careful not to dismiss those twin factors altogether, than with popular cosmologies of the time, in the belief system of the time. Ritual murder accusations proved profoundly durable because of their capacity not only to mobilize fears, but to express popular worldviews. Most people in towns like Velizh believed in blood sacrifice, not so much because of an ingrained hatred of Jews, but more often than not because the tale itself meshed well with the wide repertoire of communally shared popular beliefs and practices. And it is those particular practices and beliefs that are at the center of the society and that are so hard to penetrate. right? The use of various kinds of things for medicinal purposes, for health, for knowledge, etc. And it is those reasons that really kind of meshed well. I mean, this is a time where basically where you have the sculptsi, who are basically cutting each other's genitalia for higher religious reasons. This is the time where various people are believing in things like witchcraft and etc. So I could talk more about this in the Q&A session. So to come to grips with the pervasiveness of belief thus requires us not only to explore a time and place where ritual murder was accepted as a social fact, that is, even those higher, officials who basically said that the ritual murder did not take place, did not necessarily believe that Jews were not capable of doing something like that. We also need to then come to terms with one of the most fundamental contradictions of Jewish life in Eastern Europe, that no matter how prevalent, how widespread these beliefs may have been, and no matter the number of accusations, which were really quite small, I mean, we were talking about a small number of accusations, the largest Jewish community in the world in the 1820s and the 1830s continued to feel rooted and secure in their place of residence. At least until the second half of the 19th century, the extraordinary vitality of Jewish life, culture, and institutions expressed itself in the large demographic concentration of Jews in urban settlements like Velizh, which are basically 1/3 Jewish, but you have other, obviously, small towns that could be 80, 70, or even 90% Jewish. The indispensable role that they played in the regional economy, and you could see that in Velizh, they were certainly the movers and shakers of that town. They lived right in the center of town. They were the most wealthiest and some of the most powerful people in the town. And the fact that the vast majority of the population, of the Jewish population, felt self-confident in their cultural distinctiveness vis-a-vis their neighbors, vis-a-vis their Christian neighbors. So how do we explain this striking paradox? For starters, ritual murder cases were always sporadic in the Russian Empire. Even if exhaustive investigations of provincial archives, which I haven't looked at the kind of detail that I would like, would unearth more examples, this would not change the empirical fact that the number of Jews tried and tortured, and they were tortured, was very small. It is important, therefore, not to exaggerate the significance of the trials or their contribution to Jews' sense of vulnerability and powerlessness, especially in the first half of the 19th century. In the Russian Empire, the allegations never materialized into a full-blown panic along lines of the early modern witch hunts in France or Germany or even Poland. Nevertheless, the fact that the blood libel popped up from time to time and that so many people continued to maintain that Jews were capable of committing the crime suggests that a well-established folk culture helped legitimize the narrative. The provincial court's decision, and I only talked about the first year or so, and really the first volume, so the question is what happened next, right? Concluded only the first act of the ritual murder drama. In only a few months' time, authorities would reopen. This is the picture of the River Dvina, but I want to talk a little bit about this image right here. In only a few months' time, authorities reopened the case, this time at the request of Tsar Alexander I himself. Shortly before his death, Tsar Alexander traveled to the Sea of Azov, that is right here. And what he wanted to do, and I mean, he started off with A, and he wanted to go to the Sea of Azov to basically spend to get away from the cold St. Petersburg winter. And so what he decided to do is not to go through the major kind of points, which would include Moscow, but to go through a provincial itinerary, to get away from the crowds, to get away from the kind of the processions, if you will. So he and his wife basically picked out the most kind of reclusive itinerary that they could. And the first stop where he made in this 13-day trip, which he made in a hurry, was Velizh. And shortly before his death, this was only about 4 months' time before his death, while passing through this town, he received a sensational petition from Mahdia Terentieva. And in the petition, Mahdia revealed that a tragedy happened to her son, whom she called Damien, not Fedor. She forgot it, she confused his name, in this town of Velizh. And she argued that Hanna Tsetlina, with the help of her husband, had pierced Fedor to death, and they committed the crime for the boy's blood. So Tsar Alexander immediately instructed Governor General Nikolai Nikolaevich Khovansky, who was the most powerful bureaucrat of this northwest region, basically to investigate the case. So Khovansky sent his most trusted and experienced man, a person by the name of Strakhov, to direct the inquiry. And for the next 5 years, Strakhov interrogated dozens of residents and produced hundreds of detailed depositions, reports, and memos. The result of all this paperwork was basically all the 23, volumes of the case. This was the longest and the most comprehensive investigation of ritual murder in the modern world, which, alas, I don't have time to talk about. Thank you. So I could take questions. Yes?
Could you say a few words? I'm not sure I quite understand what ritual murder is.
Okay. Very good question. Basically, what happened was during the time of Easter Passover, usually, a boy's body would be found murdered, and it would be usually have stab wounds. And immediately the accusations would be that the Jews had done it. And as soon as this took place, basically there would be some sort of trial and some sort of investigation. And the Jews, and they asked, why did the Jews commit this sort of murder? And they argued, it was argued that the Jews committed it for ritualistic purposes, for the baking of matzah. So they used the blood itself for these ritualistic purposes. So, there's more to it, but the first investigation of something like this happened in Norwich, England, in 1144, but it was not until the next century where basically the blood itself, the motif of the blood, began to play an important role in this kind of scenario. And this and the tale itself began to basically travel from England and France, where the kind of emerged, all the way to the Holy Roman Empire in the 16th, 15th, and 17th century, where the most significant number of these types of cases were uncovered. And then by the time the 17th and 18th century, you could see these kinds of cases popping up all over Eastern Europe, and they basically continued in various forms and guises all the way up to the modern world. Yeah, there's a...
Thank you for that. It's a really remarkable story. It was great. Sorry. And I was curious to know, you talked a fair amount about the believability of blood libel among Russian, or I guess Belarusian peasants, and the possibility that it exists in their folklore. I'm wondering if you have any markers as to if it does exist in that folklore. I know that, for instance, in traditional Eastern European Jewish folklore, there's a fear that gypsies kidnap children. That was frequently mentioned. You find it in Yiddish literature. Mm-hmm. Is there something similar for blood libel in Russian literature, or Russian folklore, rather? And then a second unrelated question is whether or not this case appears in the Russian press of the period.
Okay, well, let me answer the second part of this question, which are both very important and good questions. There is no press at this time. What we have is there are official newspapers, but there is no mass circulation press, okay? And so when you look at, for example, the Damascus Affair, which happens just, a decade and a half later in the Middle East, basically this thing explodes all over the Western and really kind of world newspaper coverage. Whereas the Velizh case was basically closed off. And one of the things when the heart of the investigation begins again in the mid 1820s, the authorities not only wanted to keep it enclosed, that they saw it as a top secret case, as most of these types of investigations were, but they also wanted news not to travel about this. And so, for example, when Moses Montefiore traveled to the Russian Empire, he did not, there's no knowledge of this case. And in fact, and so news of this case did not have the same kind of worldwide or even regional kind of significance. So the newspaper coverage is very critical here, but it's the opposite of what we would kind of think, such as like the Damascus Affair or even the Velizh Affair that had kind of a worldwide resonance to it. Now, as far as folklore is concerned, we know, for example, in early modern Germany that there's various kinds of theater plays that had this kind of tale in it. But I have not uncovered any kind of tales from either the Belarusian or the Russian that had specifically that addressed this. Nevertheless, we know that from kind of the popular ideas that are expressed in not only the court cases themselves, but in other kinds of documents, that this tale does resonate. But it didn't. But in the in this part of the world, as far as chronology goes, I have not found it in any kind of printed sources. Although by the second half of the 19th century, when the newspaper media basically explodes as far as a kind of a mass circulation press is concerned, and when there's much more publishing, the tale becomes a pretty standard thing in the mass circulation press. So yes.
Sorry, can you speak into the microphone?
I appreciate your conclusion of this. It looks like a simple story, but you have very deep and humanistic conclusion, which is not very often. And I particularly appreciate because my grandfather was killed near Kiev in 1919 in pogrom, Jewish. But I do understand so it will change time. And what I want to ask you, if you travel with this area, which I've been near many times, have you ever noticed a station called Molodechna? It was a big railroad station. No, just like that. Because I travel in kayak a few times in the area from Minsk to Vilnius. Mm-hmm. And I also want some little comment about you apologized, so you took picture Lenin in his style. Lenin is a person, I'm not pro-Leninist, who brought 5 million Jews in a largest community. They brought government who was 80% was Jewish. In his Politburo in Lenin, from 14 members, 8 were Jews. Not to mention in the army. In the army, you can be, Trotsky, of course, in the Narcom, and the general commander could be former Tsar army officer, but a commissar must be Jew. So don't apologize to Lenin. Lenin did make mistake different, but what he brought to the community, to Jew, 5 million government will do.
Thank you. Okay, so there's,
I just want to mention the origins from blood libels began way back, either in temple times or post-temple times, where actually the Jews were accusing the non-Jews of ritual murder, and then it was reverted back to Jews. They transferred the blame back to Jews. The other thing I would just want to mention, the fact that the blood libel is drawing the blood, I think it's a perverted notion of that Jews aren't allowed to eat blood, and we draw the blood out of whatever food there, meat, etc., etc. And it's a perverted notion that we're drawing blood.
That's right.
We're drawing blood because we're not allowed to eat blood.
That's right.
Okay. And the other thing I just want to mention, the Golem of Prague, if you ever read the book, the idea of creating the Golem was to protect the Jewish community, the Maharal created. And there's also a whole foreword about Kabbalah versus sorcery, etc., etc. You know, how the Golem was created, and solely for that purpose, to protect Jewish communities from blood libels, and that was like in the 16th century.
That's right. Thank you. Yeah, there's a hand up behind.
Thank you very much for your presentation. I have, if I'm allowed, 4 questions, not comments. Yeah, questions. The question number 1, in your book, are you planning to do any comparison with Velizh Affair? Any parallels, something like that? Because it would be very interesting. 2 major blood label affairs in Russia.
The Velizh Affair, actually, the Velizh Affair appears in the Velizh case. And they talk about it. If you read the trial transcripts itself, they certainly reference the. It might appear very, briefly as far as an epilogue is concerned, but it's not something that is the subject of my work.
I see. No, I understand, but just compare. Fine. The second, you mentioned that there were some other cases in Russia before. Can you, or any kind of blood labels, or if any? Because I don't recall. There was in Georgia in
Yeah, that was in the 1870s.
Yeah.
But there was quite I counted about 13 between the time that, Russia acquired its Jewish population. Let me just go back to this. And about the 1840s. And they all occurred precisely in the region where the Velizh case was, right in this region, in the northwest provinces. So about 12 or 13 of them.
I see, thank you. And 2 more. Do you know about any Jewish response to this affair?
Well, that's a very interesting question. It's a very long question, but basically, or a very long answer to this question, is basically the Jews wanted to petition, they began to petition these notables, these Jewish notables who were living in St. Petersburg at that time to basically intervene in this case. And so but it didn't really, to make a long kind of answer short, is that this was not something that, it's an interest, it's going to be a chapter of it, this kind of intervening thing, but it never was to the fact, along the same lines as the Damascus affair, where you had basically West European Jews who were intervening on behalf of the Damascus community. So there was some intervention, but it was on a much smaller level.
My question was not long.
But, my answer could be long.
I understand, Jack. And the last thing is, as I recall, there was a book in Russian, Navet, label, by Rivkin. It was a fictionist.
That's right.
Yeah. Just, I'm curious if you use this as a source and how it's reliable.
Okay, well, Rivkin plays the book first appeared in Russian, and then it was translated into Yiddish, and then it came out as a small, shortened kind of children's edition in Hebrew. Rivkin was a very interesting individual because he grew up in Velizh, and he was one of the pre-revolutionary guys who wanted to get his hands on the documents. And there's, and the papers actually that are housed here at YIVO show just a really kind of a warlike atmosphere between these groups of folks who wanted to get their hands on the documents, and they wanted to and Rivkin never could actually get his hands on the Senate memorandum, which I uncovered in Washington, D.C., but he did write a very first-rate ethnography, a little, well, not so little, about a 50-page essay, a historical ethnography of the case that appeared in 1909 or 1910, that basically he was able to interview some of the folks who were still alive at that time. So Rivkin is a very interesting character.
Can you repeat the name of what is this book in Yiddish or Russian?
It's just called The Blood Libel. Yeah. So.
Did relations between Russians and Jews change after the trial?
In the town itself? Well, basically, what happened is that about 40 Jews were imprisoned in the second part of this trial. A number of important characters like Aronson, Schmerker, Berlin. Fedor's mother died 4 months after the initial trial. But a lot of these people were imprisoned. And we have the letters. We have the letters, which are remarkable. And they were, basically you had... They imprisoned the Jews, and then they imprisoned the three Mahdia Terentieva, along with 2 other women, who basically went through these long depositions about how Terentieva argued that she was the one who basically killed the boy because the Jews made her. They made her get drunk, and I mean, it was just a very kind of descriptive, very almost unbelievable, surreal type of testimony that went on. In the case itself, that made up these large volumes. Now, Strachov, one of the most, when he was faced in the initial stage, when he received basically these depositions that were quite contradictory in nature, he argued that not that these women were lying, but that they weren't revealing the truth, and hence that he needed basically to have more and more depositions. And as other kind of trials testify, either the Damascus one or the early modern German ones, basically a cohesive narrative begins to kind of come together. And that's precisely what happened in around 1827 or so. But Terentieva kept making this narrative even more and more complicated. And so the case, and then she argued that there were other cases, and so they went around, and then basically the case exploded on itself. But when the Senate reviewed all this voluminous documents, what they basically argued, it was a split decision, much like the Velizh case, is what they argued is that Jews did not, that basically there was not enough evidence to convict Jews, but we know that the Jews are capable of doing it. Very something similar that during the, if you know the Velizh Affair, that basically this is precisely the kind of decision that was made, the split decision, if you will. But to answer kind of your question about the relations of this town, I mean, Jews continue to thrive in this town. In fact, the 19th century is kind of the heyday of this town, which is in a very backward, economically depressed place, but nevertheless, you could see that the Jews were still the prime movers and shakers of this town well into the beginning of the 20th century.
Another question back here.
What were I have a couple of questions also. First, the percentage of the Jews in the town. Also, just to let you know, I've heard of blood libels, but I never realized that they did go to trial and that Jews were freed from the trial. I don't know if they're found innocent, but at least that what didn't result in a pogrom and massacres.
Mm-hmm. Sorry? So the acquittal, I mean, so is this a question or a comment?
Yes, no. I'd like to know. Okay, so my question is, what percentage of trials resulted in an acquittal?
All of them.
Really? That's...
As far as I know.
There's no indictment here.
Sorry?
There's no indictment.
Right, correct.
So you can go on for 30 years if there's no indictment. And they like to do that. Read Kafka. He can't even get an appointment in the castle. He's waiting 10 years to get an appointment, let alone a trial and an indictment. But that's kind of an issue that I'm bringing up. Time is, 2 years in jail for Velizh. That's not so sweet either. There are no amendments to the Constitution in Russia. But I mean, you made it sound like, and I agree with you because of the level of profundity of this type of case, that 12 years, that's really the interesting thing. More so than 12 years. I mean, Gogol in his, Dead Souls, things go on forever. Even after you're dead, they go on and they go on. So it's a Russian trait, let me put it that way, that time can be spent. If there is no indictment, if there is an indictment, I mean, it's a different worldview, let me put it that way.
Thank you. No, this was a different type of trial than that would happen during the, 30 or 40 years later.
Could you just answer the percentage of Jews in that particular town?
He made it. He already said there was 2,000 out of 6,000 already. You didn't pay attention.
Okay.
Okay.
Question is...
You'll be second after.
Yeah. Thank you again for your presentation. It was very enlightening. I'd like to know, was there any mention in your research, did you come across the position of the Eastern Orthodox Church and how they reacted to all of this?
That's a really good question, and I'm still working on it. I'm very much interested in the position of the church. I don't know what the position of the church was, although I should say that my inclination is that they were hands off. They didn't take a position.
But we know that the Roman Church
did
take positions on it, which was to declare it was nonsense.
That's right. We do that. That's correct. Well, the government, the Russian government, after the 1817 trial of the Grodno case, which happened relatively close to the Velizh case, basically they said that, look, this is nonsense to a point. If you could find the evidence, then we'll convict the Jews. But you have to have substantial evidence, and that was the 1817 kind of law that basically continued on throughout the 19th.
I think there's a certain element that's being missed here, that folk mythology regarding the Jew was extensive, not only in Russia, but talked about less, but the general population in Western Europe believed all kinds of things, and maybe not here in the East, but having lived in St. Louis and that area, when I first moved there about 35 years or so ago, I was asked, where were my horns?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, people still actively believe these things.
But one thing that I just want to, we could understand why, let's say in France or in early modern Germany, where Jews basically played were marginal figures, right? And so you could understand why, for example, there were, at least from my own perspective, is I could understand why the blood libel case would appear there. But here, we're not talking about the Jews were marginal figures. They were the prime movers and shakers. Yes, that they were, a minority religion but they nevertheless played a very powerful role in the regional economy. So there is a little bit of a difference there. One more, right? Yeah, you've been patient.
Make a statement. Someone was talking about culture. That I first learned about this case, and when I looked at my father's library that had 8 books translated into Yiddish from Heinrich Heine, and the story of the Rab from Bachrach in German is a very important story that was spread throughout Germany right after this case, and I think if you haven't read it, it's a good story for all the people here to read.
We could take more if, there's...
Thank you again. I'm curious to know if there is any historical memory in Velizh.
Oh, well, that's an interesting question. The last Jew in Velizh died in 1972. I don't have any pictures of the cemetery, but it's in horrible shape. There are no Jews, but there are, when I went to visit this museum, basically you have people, some from Israel, some from the U.S., who make these kind of yearly pilgrimages, if you will, to Velizh to uncover their Jewish roots, which kind of... So we were seen as these very outsiders, who are doing their Jewish thing.
The Jewish community was destroyed there in 1942. So my family actually from there, and they were destroyed. But one question I have, there was a book published in 1904 about Velizh Affair in St. Petersburg.
Guessing, yes.
About 150 pages.
Mm-hmm.
You haven't referenced it because it really goes into details of all the whole history, and from what I read, lots of these stories about the blood libel was spreading by Catholic Church.
Well, that's one of the arguments.
There was a big influence there because it was just acquired by Russia, this region, and they were trying to bring Orthodox Church there, and they would give money, and they would build a cathedral there. So there was a lot of dynamics between Catholic Church and Orthodox.
The Catholic Church or the Eastern Orthodox?
Catholic Church and Eastern Orthodox. So there was some.
Well, in this region, basically in the 1820s and 30s, Catholics were a minority, the Unionists were the majority, and the Jews were the second, the group that operated. But the book that you're referencing is Julie Gessing, who actually had access to the memorandum and was the first scholar to look at these. What he saw at that time were these 8 bundles in these archives, but he never was able to actually look at them. So yes, and then he published very quickly this book based on the memorandum itself, which became the most important history of this case. But he was never able to do much more than that.
Okay, I think we'll stop there for today. Thank you very much, Eugene. This was very interesting. We look forward to the book. Thank you all for coming.